The morning sun was barely breaking through the clouds when Dr. Amelia stepped out of her car at the private airfield. She looked nothing like what people expected from someone about to board $1 million private jet. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore simple jeans and a comfortable sweater. Dark circles under her eyes told the story of her exhausting night. 16 straight hours in the operating room, fighting to save a patient's life. She grabbed her medical bag from the passenger seat and walked toward the gleaming white aircraft, waiting on the tarmac. The jet was beautiful, with its polished exterior reflecting the early morning light. This wasn't her first time flying on a private plane for medical emergencies, but she still felt a small thrill seeing such an impressive aircraft up close. As she approached the stairs leading up to the plane, a man in a crisp pilot's uniform emerged from the cockpit. Captain David was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the confident walk of someone who had been flying for decades. He had that look pilots often had, serious, professional, and used to being in control. But when his eyes landed on Dr. Amelia, his expression changed. He stopped at the top of the stairs and looked down at her with confusion, then something that looked almost like suspicion. She could see him taking in her appearance, her casual clothes, her tired face, the way she carried herself after a long night of work. "Excuse me, miss," Captain David called down to her, his voice polite but firm. "Are you sure you're at the right aircraft?" Dr. Amelia paused, one foot on the bottom step. She had been through this before, too many times actually. The assumption that she didn't belong, that she must be lost or confused. She took a deep breath and kept her voice calm and professional. "Good morning, Captain. I'm Dr. Amelia Richardson. I believe I'm scheduled for the flight to Chicago this morning." The pilot's eyebrows rose slightly. He looked her up and down again, and she could practically see the wheels turning in his head. Private jets cost thousands of dollars per flight. The people who typically boarded his aircraft wore expensive suits, carried designer luggage, and had that unmistakable air of wealth about them. "I think there might be some confusion here," Captain David said, not moving from his position at the top of the stairs. "This is a private charter flight, very expensive. Are you sure you don't need the commercial terminal? It's about a mile that way." He pointed toward the main airport building in the distance. Dr. Amelia felt that familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had faced this kind of treatment in hospitals, at conferences, even at the grocery store sometimes. But she had learned, long ago, that losing her temper never helped anything. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, where she had saved her boarding confirmation. "I have my booking confirmation right here," she said, holding up the phone. "Flight departing at 8:30 a.m. to Chicago O'Hare. Dr. Amelia Richardson." Captain David barely glanced at the phone. Instead, he shook his head with what looked like pity, as if he was dealing with someone who was genuinely confused about their situation. "Listen, miss," he said, his tone becoming slightly condescending. "I've been flying these jets for 20 years. I know my passengers and I know what they look like. This flight is for very important people, doctors, lawyers, business executives, people who can afford this kind of travel." Inside the cockpit, his co-pilot James was watching the exchange through the window. James was younger, maybe in his 30s, and he looked uncomfortable with what was happening. He had seen Dr. Amelia's name on the passenger manifest that morning. He knew she was supposed to be on this flight, but Captain David was his boss and James had only been working for this aviation company for 6 months. He needed this job. Dr. Amelia felt her patience starting to wear thin, but she kept her voice steady. "Captain, I understand there might be some confusion, but I assure you I'm in the right place. I'm a cardiovascular surgeon, and I'm flying to Chicago for an emergency consultation. A patient's life depends on me getting there as quickly as possible." The pilot actually laughed. Not a mean laugh, but the kind of laugh someone makes when they think they're dealing with someone who's clearly delusional. "A surgeon?" he said. "Look, I'm sure you're a very nice person, but you don't look like any surgeon I've ever met. And trust me, I've flown plenty of doctors. They don't show up looking like—" He gestured vaguely at her appearance. "What, Captain?" David didn't know was that Dr. Amelia had just finished the most difficult surgery of her career. A young father had been brought into the emergency room with a massive heart attack, and she had spent the entire night fighting to save his life. She had barely had time to change out of her scrubs before rushing to catch this flight. She had been one of the top cardiovascular surgeons in the country for over 10 years. She had saved hundreds of lives, published research papers, and spoken at medical conferences around the world. But none of that seemed to matter when people looked at her and made their assumptions. "I can call my assistant to confirm the booking," Dr. Amelia said, pulling out her phone again. "Or perhaps you could check your passenger list." Captain David crossed his arms. "Lady, I don't know who you think you're fooling, but this isn't going to work. Private jets aren't like buses. You can't just show up and hope to get on. These flights cost more money than most people make in a year." By now, other passengers were starting to arrive. A businessman in an expensive suit pulled up in a black sedan and began walking toward the aircraft. He nodded politely to Dr. Amelia as he passed, but she could see him taking in the scene with curiosity. Another passenger, an older woman who looked like she was used to luxury travel, emerged from a limousine. She had perfectly styled gray hair and wore a designer outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She too noticed the discussion happening at the bottom of the aircraft stairs. Dr. Amelia could feel their eyes on her, and she knew what they were thinking. She'd been in this situation enough times to recognize the look, the mixture of curiosity and judgment, the silent question of what she was doing there. "Captain," she said, her voice still calm, but with a slight edge to it now. "I'm going to call my assistant to confirm my booking, but I want to be very clear. I am supposed to be on this flight and I need to get to Chicago as soon as possible. A patient is waiting for me." She dialed her assistant's number, hoping that maybe hearing the confirmation from someone else would finally convince this stubborn pilot that she belonged on the aircraft. But as she waited for her assistant to answer, she couldn't help but wonder how many times she would have to go through this same scene. How many times would she have to prove that she belonged in spaces where people didn't expect to see someone who looked like her? The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Dr. Amelia watched as Captain David stood firmly at the top of the stairs, clearly having no intention of letting her board his aircraft. She could see the other passengers watching, probably wondering what kind of drama was unfolding before their morning flight. What none of them knew was that this story was about to take a turn that would change everything. Dr. Amelia's assistant finally picked up the phone after what felt like forever. "Good morning, Dr. Richardson. I was just about to call you. Is everything okay with your flight?" "Thank you for answering, Lisa," Dr. Amelia said, making sure her voice was loud enough for Captain David to hear. "I'm at the airfield, but there seems to be some confusion about my booking. Could you please confirm my flight details?" She could hear Lisa typing on her computer. "Of course, Doctor. You're booked on the private charter flight departing at 8:30 this morning to Chicago O'Hare. Flight confirmation number is 7429 Alpha. The booking was made 3 days ago and fully paid for by the hospital's emergency fund." Dr. Amelia looked up at Captain David, who was still standing at the top of the stairs with his arms crossed. "Did you hear that, Captain? My confirmation number is 7429 Alpha." But instead of checking his passenger list, Captain David just shook his head with that same pitying expression. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but this isn't going to work. Anyone can make up a confirmation number." The businessman who had arrived earlier was now standing a few feet away, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but not sure if he should get involved. The older woman in the designer outfit had stopped walking and was openly staring at the scene unfolding before her. Dr. Amelia felt her heart rate increasing, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had learned long ago that showing anger or frustration in these situations only made things worse. People would use her emotions against her, claiming she was being difficult or aggressive. "Captain, I'm not playing any games," she said, steadily. "I'm a doctor and I have a patient waiting for me in Chicago. Could you please just check your passenger manifest?" Captain David actually rolled his eyes. "Fine, if it'll make you go away faster." He turned and walked back into the cockpit, returning a moment later with a clipboard. He made a big show of looking through the papers, but Dr. Amelia could tell he was barely even reading them. "Nope, don't see any Dr. Richardson on here," he said, though she was almost certain he hadn't actually looked carefully. "Like I told you, this flight is for important people, wealthy people, people who belong on private jets." The way he said "people who belong" made Dr. Amelia's stomach turn. She had heard those words before, in different contexts, but with the same underlying meaning. People who looked like her often had to prove they belonged in spaces that others took for granted. "What exactly do you mean by people who belong?" she asked, her voice still calm but with a slight edge that anyone paying attention would have noticed. Captain David seemed to realize he might have said something he shouldn't have. "I just mean, people who can afford this kind of thing. Nothing personal, but you have to understand we get all kinds of people trying to sneak onto these flights. It's my job to make sure only the right passengers get on board." Inside the cockpit, James was getting more and more uncomfortable. He had found Dr. Richardson's name on the passenger list. It was right there in black and white. But Captain David was his superior, and he had made it clear that he didn't tolerate being questioned by junior crew members. James had bills to pay and a family to support. He couldn't afford to lose this job. But watching this scene unfold was making him feel sick to his stomach. He had a daughter at home, and he couldn't help but think about how he would feel if someone treated her this way someday. The businessman finally spoke up. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Captain David. "I couldn't help but overhear. Is there really a problem with this lady's booking? She seems to have all her documentation." Captain David turned to him with a completely different expression. Respectful, almost deferential. "Oh, no problem at all, sir. Just a small misunderstanding. Some people sometimes get confused about which flights they're supposed to be on. We'll have this sorted out in just a minute." The contrast in how he spoke to the businessman versus how he had been speaking to Dr. Amelia was so obvious that even the older woman noticed it. She frowned and moved closer to hear what was happening. "I'm not confused," Dr. Amelia said firmly. "I know exactly where I'm supposed to be. I have my confirmation, I have my identification, and I have a patient in Chicago who needs me." "Captain," David turned back to her, and now his tone was getting more openly condescending. "Listen, miss, I've been very patient with you, but this is getting ridiculous. Private jet travel isn't like taking the city bus. You can't just show up and expect to get on. These seats cost more than most people make in a month." "How much do you think this flight costs?" Dr. Amelia asked quietly. Captain David looked surprised by the question. "Well, a flight like this, probably $15,000, maybe $20,000. And you don't think I can afford that? I'm not trying to be rude, but look at yourself. You're wearing jeans and sneakers. Your hair is a mess. You look like you haven't slept all night. The people who fly on these jets, they look like..." He gestured toward the businessman and the older woman. "They look successful, professional." What Captain David didn't understand was that success and professionalism came in many different forms. Dr. Amelia's messy hair was from leaning over an operating table for 16 hours straight. Her tired eyes were from staying awake all night to save a human life. Her casual clothes were because she had rushed straight from the hospital to catch this flight. "I am a professional," she said, her voice still steady, but with steel underneath it. "I'm a cardiovascular surgeon. I've spent the last 16 hours in surgery saving a man's life. I'm flying to Chicago because another patient needs emergency consultation that could mean the difference between life and death. So please, Captain, check your passenger list one more time." But Captain David was clearly not convinced. In his mind, he had already decided what kind of person Dr. Amelia was, and nothing she said was going to change that opinion. "Look, I'm sorry, but I can't let you on this aircraft," he said with finality. "I don't know how you got this confirmation number or where you got this story about being a doctor, but I'm not buying it. These flights are for legitimate passengers only." The businessman looked shocked. "Captain, are you sure about this? She seems very credible to me." "Sir, with all due respect, I know how to do my job," Captain David replied. "I've been flying for 20 years, and I can spot troublemakers from a mile away." Dr. Amelia felt something inside her chest tighten. Not anger. She had learned to control that long ago. But a deep, familiar sadness. This was what it felt like to be judged not by her qualifications, her achievements, or her character, but by assumptions people made the moment they looked at her. She thought about the patient waiting for her in Chicago, a young mother with a rare heart condition that only a handful of surgeons in the country knew how to treat. Dr. Amelia was one of those surgeons. If she didn't make it to Chicago, today that woman might not see her children grow up. "Captain," she said one last time, her voice carrying the weight of years of similar experiences. "I'm asking you, as one professional to another, please check your passenger list. Please call the charter company. Please do whatever you need to do to verify that I belong on this flight." But Captain David had made up his mind. He shook his head and started walking back toward the cockpit. "I'm sorry, but you're going to have to leave the premises. If you don't go voluntarily, I'll have to call security." That's when they all heard the sound of a car door slamming in the distance. Dr. Amelia turned to see a black SUV pulling up to the aircraft. Her heart jumped. She recognized that vehicle. Captain David noticed the SUV too, but he couldn't see who was getting out from his position at the top of the stairs. He assumed it was just another passenger arriving for the flight. What he didn't know was that his entire world was about to change. The black SUV came to a smooth stop just 30 feet away from the aircraft. Dr. Amelia felt a wave of relief wash over her as she recognized the familiar vehicle. She knew exactly who was behind those tinted windows, and for the first time since this whole mess started, she allowed herself to smile just a little. Captain David was still standing at the top of the stairs, completely focused on what he saw as his problem passenger. He barely glanced at the SUV, assuming it was just another wealthy client arriving for the flight. In his 20 years of flying private jets, he had seen countless expensive cars drop off passengers at airfields like this one. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a tall, well-dressed man in his early 40s. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who was used to being in charge, but there was nothing showy or arrogant about him. He wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, but he carried himself with the kind of calm dignity that couldn't be bought. This was Robert, Dr. Amelia's husband of 12 years. And what Captain David was about to discover would change everything. Robert closed the car door and began walking toward the aircraft with measured steps. His expression was neutral, but Dr. Amelia could see the slight tightness around his eyes that meant he was taking in every detail of the scene before him. She knew that look. It was the same expression he wore in boardroom negotiations when he was sizing up a situation before making his move. As Robert got closer, Captain David finally took a good look at him. Something about the man's presence made the pilot straighten up instinctively. This was clearly someone important, someone who belonged in the world of private jets and luxury travel. The kind of passenger Captain David was used to treating with respect and deference. But what Captain David didn't notice was the way Robert's jaw tightened slightly when he saw his wife standing at the bottom of the aircraft stairs, clearly being prevented from boarding. What he didn't see was the flash of anger that crossed Robert's face before he controlled it and returned to his calm, professional demeanor. Robert had built his entire career on reading situations quickly and responding appropriately. Right. Now he could see that his wife, one of the most accomplished doctors in the country, was being treated like she didn't belong on an aircraft that his company actually owned. "Good morning," Robert said as he approached the group. His voice was pleasant, conversational, but Dr. Amelia could hear the steel underneath it. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Captain David immediately came down a few steps, his whole demeanor changing completely. "Good morning, sir. Not interrupting at all. Just dealing with a small situation here. Nothing that can't be handled quickly." The businessman and the older woman were both watching this new development. With fascination, they could sense that something significant was about to happen, though they weren't sure what. Robert smiled politely and extended his hand to Captain David. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Robert Richardson." Captain David shook his hand eagerly. "Captain David Mills, sir. It's a pleasure to meet you. Are you one of our passengers today?" "Actually," Robert said, his smile never wavering, "I think there might be some confusion here. I'm Robert Richardson, CEO of Richardson Aviation Holdings." For a moment, Captain David just stared at him blankly. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. Then slowly, the color began to drain from his face as the realization hit him. Richardson Aviation Holdings, the company that owned this aircraft. The company that owned the entire fleet of jets that Captain David had been flying for the past 5 years. The company that signed his paychecks. "Oh," Captain David said, and his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Oh no." Robert's smile remained perfectly in place, but his eyes were ice cold now. "I believe you've been speaking with my wife, Dr. Amelia Richardson." He gestured toward Dr. Amelia, who was still standing patiently at the bottom of the stairs. "She mentioned she was having some difficulty boarding the aircraft this morning." Captain David's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He looked back and forth between Robert and Dr. Amelia, his mind desperately trying to process what was happening. The woman he had been dismissing and insulting for the past 20 minutes wasn't just a passenger on this flight. She was the wife of his boss, the owner of the company, the owner of the plane. Captain David stammered, but no coherent words came out. Inside the cockpit, James had heard Robert introduce himself, and he felt like he was going to be sick. He had known Dr. Richardson's name was on the passenger list. He had known she was supposed to be on this flight. And he had said nothing while Captain David humiliated her. Robert walked over to his wife and gently took her hand. "Darling, I'm so sorry I'm late. The meeting ran longer than expected." He kissed her cheek softly, and Dr. Amelia felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "I hope you haven't been waiting long." "Not too long," Dr. Amelia said quietly, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Robert turned back to Captain David, who was now visibly sweating despite the cool morning air. "Captain Mills, isn't it? I have to say I'm very interested to hear about this situation my wife mentioned. She said there was some question about whether she belonged on this aircraft?" The businessman and the older woman were now openly staring. They had both realized that they were witnessing something extraordinary, the kind of moment that people would talk about for years afterward. Captain David tried to pull himself together. "Mr. Richardson, sir, there was just a small misunderstanding. Nothing serious, just a miscommunication about the passenger list." "A miscommunication?" Robert's voice remained calm and pleasant, but there was something dangerous underneath it now. "That's interesting, because from what I understand, my wife showed you her booking confirmation, her identification, and even had her assistant verify the flight details. Yet you still refused to let her board. Is that correct?" Captain David was trapped, and he knew it. He couldn't deny what had happened. There were witnesses, but he also couldn't explain his behavior without admitting to something that would end his career. "Sir, I was just being cautious. We have to be careful about security, you understand. Sometimes people try to—" He trailed off, realizing that any explanation he gave would only make things worse. "Try to what, Captain?" Robert asked, his voice still deadly calm. "Try to board aircraft they own?" Dr. Amelia watched her husband with a mixture of love and admiration. She had seen him in action in business situations before, but never when it was personal like this. Robert was known in the corporate world for being tough but fair, calm under pressure, and absolutely ruthless when someone crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. "What I'm curious about," Robert continued, "is what exactly made you think my wife didn't belong on this aircraft? She's an accomplished cardiovascular surgeon. She's flown on private jets dozens of times for medical emergencies. She had all the proper documentation. So what was it exactly that made you decide she was trying to scam her way onto a flight?" Captain David looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. He glanced around desperately, as if hoping someone would rescue him from this situation, but the other passengers were just watching in fascinated silence. I made an error in judgment, sir," he finally managed to say. "An error in judgment," Robert repeated slowly, as if he was tasting the words. "That's one way to put it." He looked at his wife, then back at Captain David. "Tell me, Captain, in your 20 years of flying, how many other passengers have you refused to let board based on their appearance? How many other people have you decided didn't look like they belonged on a private jet?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Captain David knew that anything he said now would be used against him. If he admitted this had happened before, he was admitting to a pattern of discriminatory behavior. If he claimed it had never happened before, he was admitting that something specific about Dr. Amelia had triggered his prejudice. Robert didn't wait for an answer. He had already made his decision. "James," He called out to the co-pilot, who was still hiding in the cockpit. "Could you come out here, please?" James appeared in the doorway, looking like a man walking to his own execution. "James, you witnessed this entire exchange, didn't you?" Robert asked. James nodded miserably. "Yes, sir." "And at any point during this exchange did you think to mention to Captain Mills that Dr. Richardson's name was on the passenger manifest?" James's face crumpled. "No, sir, I should have. I'm sorry, sir." Robert nodded slowly. "I see." The morning air was completely still now. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Robert stood there perfectly calm, waiting for someone to give him an explanation that would make sense of what had just happened to his wife. But everyone knew that no explanation could possibly justify what they had all witnessed. Captain David's mind was racing, trying to find some way out of this disaster. In all his years of flying, he had never found himself in a situation like this. He had always prided himself on being professional, on knowing how to handle difficult passengers. But now he realized that he had been the difficult one all along. "Mr. Richardson," Captain David began, his voice shaking slightly. "I want to apologize. This was all just a big misunderstanding. Your wife is obviously a very accomplished woman, and I should have listened to her from the beginning." Robert tilted, his head slightly studying the pilot with the same intensity he used when evaluating a business deal that had gone wrong. "A misunderstanding," he repeated. "That's the second time you've used that word. I'm beginning to think you don't understand what that word means." Dr. Amelia watched her husband work. She had seen him in situations like this before, though never when it was personal. Robert had a gift for staying calm when everyone else was losing their composure. It was one of the things that had made him so successful in business, and one of the reasons she had fallen in love with him. The businessman who had been watching this whole scene unfold finally spoke up. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Robert. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think you should know that I witnessed this entire exchange. Your wife was nothing but professional and patient, even when she was being treated very unfairly." Robert turned to him with a grateful nod. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson, Tom Johnson. I'm actually scheduled to be on this flight as well." He looked uncomfortable but determined to speak the truth. "Captain Mills here refused to even look at your wife's documentation properly. He kept insisting that she didn't belong on the plane because of how she looked." The older woman in the designer outfit stepped forward as well. "I saw the whole thing too," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who wasn't used to being ignored. "I'm Mrs. Patricia Williams, and I've been flying on private jets for 30 years. I've never seen a pilot treat a legitimate passenger with such disrespect." Robert's expression didn't change, but Dr. Amelia could see the muscle in his jaw tighten slightly. He was getting angrier, but he was controlling it in that way that made him even more formidable than if he had started shouting. "Thank you both," Robert said politely. "I appreciate you speaking up." He turned back to Captain David. "So now we have multiple witnesses confirming that this wasn't a misunderstanding at all. This was you making assumptions about my wife based on her appearance and refusing to treat her with basic respect." Captain David was sweating now, and not because of the temperature. "Sir, I realize I made a mistake, but you have to understand, in this business, we have to be careful. We get all kinds of people trying to sneak onto these flights. I was just doing my job." "Your job," Robert said, and there was something deadly quiet about his voice now, "is to provide excellent service to the passengers who pay for these flights. Your job is to treat every person who approaches this aircraft with professionalism and courtesy. Your job is to check the passenger manifest when someone presents valid documentation, not to make judgments based on whether someone looks wealthy enough for your standards." James, the co-pilot, was still standing in the doorway of the cockpit, looking like he wanted to disappear. He knew his silence had made him complicit in what had happened, and he could see his career crashing down around him. "And you, James," Robert said, turning his attention to the younger man. "You knew Dr. Richardson was on the passenger list, didn't you?" James nodded miserably. "Yes, sir. I saw her name this morning when we reviewed the manifest. And yet you..." said nothing while Captain Mills refused to let her board the aircraft she partially owns. I was afraid to contradict my superior, sir. I know that's not an excuse, but I needed this job, and Captain Mills made it clear that he didn't like being questioned. Robert studied James for a moment. Fear is understandable, James. But there are moments in life when staying silent makes you part of the problem. This was one of those moments. Dr. Amelia felt a surge of pride watching her husband handle this situation. He wasn't screaming or making threats. He was simply stating facts and letting the weight of those facts speak for themselves. It was far more effective than any amount of anger could have been. Now, Robert continued, I want to understand something. Captain Mills, you've been flying for Richardson Aviation Holdings for 5 years. In all that time, have you ever bothered to learn anything about the company that employs you? Have you ever looked at our corporate website, our mission statement, our values? Captain David looked confused by the question. Well, I know it's a successful aviation company. Richardson Aviation Holdings was founded 12 years ago, Robert said, his voice taking on the tone of someone giving a lecture. We started with one small aircraft that we used to transport medical personnel to emergency situations. Today, we operate a fleet of 37 aircraft serving clients across the country. He gestured toward Dr. Amelia. The company was founded because my wife, Dr. Amelia Richardson, was frustrated by how difficult it was to get to patients who needed emergency care in remote locations. She wanted to create an aviation service that would prioritize medical emergencies and humanitarian missions alongside our commercial operations. Captain David's face was growing paler by the minute as he began to understand the full scope of his mistake. Our mission statement, Robert continued, which is printed on every employment contract and posted in every break room, states that we are committed to treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their background, appearance, or circumstances. We believe that access to quality service should never depend on someone's ability to look the part. Mrs. Williams nodded approvingly. That's a beautiful mission statement, she said. It's a shame not all of your employees seem to have read it. Robert smiled at her, the first genuine smile he had shown since arriving. Thank you, Mrs. Williams. We try to hire people who share those values. Sometimes we make mistakes in our hiring decisions. The implication was clear, and Captain David felt it like a physical blow. He tried one more desperate attempt to save his job. Mr. Richardson, please. I've been flying for 20 years without any incidents. This was just one mistake. I promise it will never happen again. I can learn from this. I can do better. Robert looked at him for a long moment, and for just a second Captain David thought he might have a chance. Then Robert shook his head slowly. Captain Mills, the problem isn't that you made one mistake. The problem is that you made this mistake, despite having every opportunity to correct it. My wife showed you her documentation. She explained who she was and why she was traveling. She even had her assistant confirm her booking. At any point, you could have checked the passenger manifest. At any point, you could have treated her with basic courtesy. He paused, letting that sink in. Instead, you doubled down on your assumptions. You became more dismissive, more condescending. You told her she didn't look like she belonged on a private jet. You questioned whether she could afford to be here. You made it clear that in your mind, she was the type of person who didn't deserve respect. Captain David opened his mouth to argue, but Robert held up a hand to stop him. But what troubles me most, Robert continued, is that this wasn't really about my wife being a doctor or having money or being able to afford this flight. This was about you looking at her and deciding that someone who looks like her doesn't belong in the same spaces as people who look like you. The truth of those words hung in the air like a weight that no one could ignore. Everyone present knew that Robert had just named the real issue, the one that no one had wanted to say out loud. Dr. Amelia felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. For so many years, she had faced situations like this and had been told she was being too sensitive, that she was imagining things, that it wasn't really about race. But here was her husband, calling it exactly what it was, in front of witnesses who couldn't deny what they had seen. Captain David's last hope crumbled. He knew there was nothing more he could say. Robert looked at his watch, then back at Captain David. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Everyone on the tarmac knew that whatever happened next would change everything. "Captain Mills," Robert said finally, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Your employment with Richardson Aviation Holdings is terminated. Effective immediately." The words hit Captain David like a physical blow. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing it said out loud made it real in a way that left him breathless. 20 years of flying, 5 years with this company, and it was all over because of 30 minutes of terrible judgment. "Sir, please." Captain David tried one last time, his voice cracking. "I have a family. I have bills to pay. This job is everything to me. Can't we find some other way to handle this? Some kind of probation or training program?" Robert's expression didn't soften. "Captain Mills, when you decided that my wife didn't look like she belonged on this aircraft, you weren't just making a decision about one passenger. You were representing my company's values to everyone watching. You were telling the world what Richardson Aviation Holdings stands for." He gestured toward the other passengers. "Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Williams witnessed how you treated a paying customer. They saw you refuse basic courtesy to a woman who has saved hundreds of lives, who co-owns this aircraft, who represents everything our company claims to value. What? Do you think they're going to tell their friends and colleagues about flying with us?" Mrs. Williams nodded firmly. "I can tell you right now, young man, that I will never forget what I saw here today. The way you treated that lovely doctor was absolutely shameful," Mr. Johnson agreed. "I've been in business for 30 years, and I know that one employee's behavior can destroy a company's reputation overnight. You're lucky Mr. Richardson is handling this as professionally as he is." Captain David felt the walls closing in around him. He looked at Dr. Amelia, hoping to find some mercy in her eyes, but she just looked tired. Not angry, not vindictive, just exhausted by having to deal with yet another situation like this. "Mrs. Richardson," Captain David said desperately, "I know I was wrong, I know I hurt you, and I'm truly sorry. Is there anything I can do to make this right?" Dr. Amelia looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Captain Mills, this isn't the first time something like this has happened to me. It probably won't be the last. But what hurts the most isn't the disrespect itself. It's the fact that you had so many opportunities to see me as a person, to listen to what I was telling you, and you chose not to take any of them." Her voice was quiet but steady. "You looked at me and decided who I was before I even said a word. You decided what I was capable of affording, what kind of life I lived, whether I deserved basic courtesy. And when I tried to show you that your assumptions were wrong, you held on to them even tighter." Captain David felt ashamed in a way he had never experienced before. I didn't realize I was doing that." "But that's the problem," Dr. Amelia continued. "You didn't realize it because you never had to think about it. You never had to wonder if someone was going to question whether you belonged somewhere. You never had to carry extra documentation just to prove you had a right to be in certain spaces. You never had to work twice as hard to get half the respect." Robert watched his wife speak and felt his heart swell with pride. Even in this moment, when she had every right to be angry, she was trying to educate rather than simply punish. It was one of the many reasons he loved her. "James," Robert said, turning to the co-pilot who had been standing silently through this entire exchange. "You're also terminated, effective immediately." James nodded miserably. "I understand, sir. I should have spoken up. I should have done the right thing." "Yes, you should have," Robert agreed. "But I want you to understand something. Your silence wasn't neutral. When you watched Captain Mills treat my wife with disrespect and chose to say nothing, you became part of the problem. Your job wasn't just to fly the plane. It was to uphold the standards of professionalism that our company demands." Robert pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "This is Robert Richardson. I need a replacement flight crew at the downtown airfield immediately. Yes, it's urgent. Thank you." He hung up and addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this delay. We'll have a new crew here within 30 minutes and you'll be on your way to Chicago shortly." Mrs. Williams spoke up. "Mr. Richardson, I have to say I'm impressed by how you've handled this situation. It can't be easy to fire employees even when they deserve it." "It's never easy," Robert admitted. But some decisions are more important than comfort. Our company's reputation and values matter more than avoiding difficult conversations. Captain, David was gathering his belongings from the cockpit, his movements slow and defeated. As he walked past Dr. Amelia, he stopped and turned to her one more time. "Dr. Richardson," he said quietly, "I know this doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know that I'm going to think about what you said. I'm going to try to understand how my actions affected you. Maybe this will help me be a better person." Dr. Amelia nodded. "I hope so, Captain Mills. I really do." As Captain David and James walked away from the aircraft, heading toward their cars in the parking area, the atmosphere on the tarmac began to change. The tension that had filled the air for the past hour was finally starting to lift. The new flight crew arrived exactly when Robert had promised they would. Captain Angela Martinez and First Officer Kevin Chen were both experienced pilots who had worked for Richardson Aviation Holdings for several years. They knew the company's values and took pride in upholding them. "Good morning, everyone," Captain Martinez said cheerfully as she approached the group. "I'm Captain Martinez and this is First Officer Chen. We're here to get you to Chicago safely and comfortably." She turned to Dr. Amelia with a warm smile. "Dr. Richardson, it's an honor to have you aboard. I've heard about your work at the Children's Hospital. My daughter actually had heart surgery there 2 years ago." Dr. Amelia's face lit up. "Really? What's her name?" "I might remember her. Sophia Martinez. She was 8 years old, had a hole in her heart that needed repair." "Sophia," Dr. Amelia exclaimed. "Of course I remember her. She was such a brave little girl. How is she doing now?" "She's perfect," Captain Martinez said, her eyes getting a little watery. "Running around, playing, soccer, living a completely normal life thanks to you and your team." Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Williams watched this exchange with interest. This was so different from what they had witnessed earlier. Here was a pilot treating Dr. Amelia not just with professional courtesy, but with genuine warmth and respect. "This is how it should be," Mrs. Williams murmured to Mr. Johnson. "This is how people should treat each other." As everyone boarded the aircraft, Dr. Amelia felt the stress of the morning finally beginning to fade. She settled into her seat next to Robert, who took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. "I'm okay," she said, and meant it. "It was hard, but I think something good came out of it. Maybe Captain Mills really will think about what happened. Maybe he'll treat the next person differently. And if he doesn't," Dr. Amelia shrugged, "then at least he won't be doing it while representing our company." As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Dr. Amelia thought about her patient waiting in Chicago. Mrs. Jennifer Thompson, a 34-year-old mother of 3 who had been born with a rare heart defect that was now threatening her life. Dr. Amelia was one of only a handful of surgeons in the country who specialized in this particular condition. Thanks to the delay, she would arrive later than planned, but she would still make it in time. Mrs. Thompson would get the surgery she needed. Her children would still have their mother. Captain Martinez's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're cleared for takeoff. Flight time to Chicago will be approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes. We know you have choices when it comes to air travel, and we appreciate you choosing Richardson Aviation Holdings, as I." The plane lifted off the ground. Dr. Amelia looked out the window at the world below. She thought about all the other people who faced situations like the one she had experienced that morning. People who were judged by their appearance, who had to prove they belonged in spaces that others took for granted. She thought about her work at the hospital, where she fought every day to save lives regardless of who those lives belonged to. Rich or poor, young or old, it didn't matter to her. A heart was a heart, and everyone deserved to keep beating. Maybe that was the real lesson from today. Not that bad things would stop happening, but that there were still good people willing to stand up when they did. People like Robert, who used his position to demand better. People like Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Williams, who spoke up as witnesses. People like Captain Martinez, who treated everyone with dignity. As Chicago came into view below them, Dr. Amelia smiled. She had a life to save, and nothing was going to stop her from doing exactly that.